All right, so this is a mini lecture on ethnic and cultural identity. And for our purposes, ethnic, racial, and cultural identity are all interchangeable. I know that there are differences between them, but the process of developing identity for your ethnic or cultural or racial group is the same. So there are certainly issues, that are particular to particular cultural groups. So, for example, if you are a part of a family that has a history of immigration, like your first or second or third generation in the U.S., then there are processes of acculturation that are involved. So that's a little different, and we're not really going to talk about that in this little mini lecture. But I recognize that there are differences between cultural and ethnic groups in that kind of issue of generational status and acculturation. So, for development of ethnic and cultural identity, there's different theories, and so some theories really talk about the different dimensions of racial or ethnic identity. This is a very common one, the multidimensional model of racial identity, or the MMRI. And it talks about four different dimensions. There's salience. So, how central or aware are you of your ethnic identity in a given situation? So, for example, I'm white, and for the most part, I rarely think about my whiteness, but if I am in a situation where I'm in the minority, then all of a sudden I'll be very conscious of my ethnic identity. So your salience, how much it is in your consciousness at a given time, will depend a bit on the situation. Centrality refers to how big a part of your overall identity your ethnic identity is. So this tends to be pretty stable. And for members of ethnic minority groups in any society, centrality tends to be higher than for members of the majority group. Regard refers to how you feel about your ethnic group. So this is things like, I'm proud to be a member of my ethnic group. I think that other people have this view of my ethnic group. So it's sort of awareness of stereotypes about your group. Awareness of expectations, awareness of prejudices and biases, things like that are all part of regard. And then ideology refers to how you believe, or one believes, that members of one's ethnic group should behave. So you will see people say things like, let's see, like, I'm Jewish, and I had somebody come up to me and tell me that as a Jewish person, I really need to be more active in denouncing the treatment of Palestinians in Israel. I've never been to Israel. I don't really do anything Jewish. It's just sort of my heritage. So, but that person had a very strong ideology about, if you're a member of a certain cultural or ethnic group, then this is how you should behave. Another example would be if a Hispanic person has strong beliefs about whether Hispanic people in the U.S. should speak Spanish, or that would be an ideology. Okay, so these are dimensions of ethnic identity: salience, centrality, regard, and ideology, and then examples to kind of illustrate each one. Another area of research on ethnic identity really talks about how it develops. And Quintana's got a pretty famous four-stage model of ethnic identity development. Again, just like gender identity and other identity, their stage models are very common. So in Quintana's stage model, the first stage is young children becoming aware of their ethnicity based on physical cues, but not really aware of the social construction of identity. So you might have an African American child recognize that their skin is darker than a white kid, and might know that the terms for people who look like them are Black or African American, but won't really understand that there's a whole sort of social construction about what it means to be Black, both for members of the Black ethnicity and for those who aren't Black, and how people who aren't Black look at people who are Black, and stereotypes and all that stuff is not there in the earliest stages of ethnic identity. In the second stage, kids do start to recognize that race and ethnicity are social labels, and that they're associated with certain customs. This is what it means to be Black. This is what other people think about Black people. So they start to become aware of that. In adolescence, people begin to understand the consequences of belonging to various ethnic groups. So this is really where people start to get a sense of what is racism about? What is privilege about? If I am African American, say, then are there consequences of my interactions with the police that might not be the same as consequences for somebody who's white? So this is where you really start to understand the complexities of being a member of a particular ethnic or cultural group, and what the consequences of that might be. And then by mid-adolescence and into adulthood, you develop an awareness of the values and importance of your ethnicity in your overall identity. And this is just part of sort of the identity search that happens in adolescence. You become very aware that being a member of a cultural or ethnic group is an important part of who you are, and you might start to actively search for, okay, so what does that mean in terms of my values, my behavior, that kind of stuff. So there's this commitment to membership in your ethnic or cultural group. Again, a lot of this stuff doesn't really happen for members of the majority group. It's just not that salient an issue. But if you're a member of a minority group in any culture, it often is a very salient issue, and this is a big part of identity development. Cross presented a model. This is specifically for African American identity, and again, it's a stage model, and this one's very interesting and has been looked at a lot. And the idea is that as children, there's not, before you have sort of an encounter, if you're African American, you just kind of accept the cultural norms of white people, that Disneyland is good, and whatever's kind of presented in the broader society is just sort of unquestioned. And then something happens. Then there's an encounter. There's a trigger experience, and that can be something like all of a sudden the white friend that you had when you were growing up doesn't want to be friends anymore, or somebody might throw a racist comment at you, or you might get pulled over by the police and asked why you're in the particular neighborhood, or something like that. So some sort of encounter will happen, a trigger that will make you question this sort of open-ended acceptance of the broader society's values. Once the encounter happens, then there's an immersion, and this is a deep search for information about African American culture. All right, I was cruising along, I didn't really question things, then something happened that made me really question, made me really aware of my ethnic identity, and made me question, what does it mean to be a member of this culture? And it's a search for information, it's a search for sort of schema building to develop a more sophisticated and articulated schema about what does it mean to be African American in this culture. And finally, there's a stage of internalization, where once you've learned about your culture, you internalize that and make that your own. So that means it becomes important to you. It becomes part of your value structure. So that's one model of sort of the development of identity, specifically for African Americans, but you can see how this might apply to anybody who is not a member of the majority culture in whatever country. Okay, let me finish with this. These models of developing identity, that there's the stage theories that we just talked about, and then there's sort of the Marcia view, Finney really made this popularized, and that is that developing an ethnic identity follows the same exploration and commitment phases that Finney talked about. And so at first, adolescents aren't really examining their ethnic identity. And then, as Cross said, something will happen and they'll start to really seek information. And that's the exploration stage. And finally, they'll develop a clear sense of their ethnicity and a commitment to a set of values, whatever values someone might develop as an understanding of what it means to be a member of that ethnic or cultural group. And that's the commitment stage. So as Erickson talked about it, it looks a lot like what Cross was talking about, where there's sort of an unexamined period, and then something happens and there's an information seeking period, and then there's a commitment to a set of values and beliefs that is your ethnic identity or your cultural identity. So that's kind of how it works.